So again, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Jen Kuhl. I'm the Network and Engagement Lead with the Global Climate and Health Alliance. And today I am hosting the call from the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations in what is more internationally known now as Vancouver, Canada, and in all work, but particularly in work on the climate crisis. I think it's important to be mindful of whose land we're on and how gently we're walking on it, and how are we in relation to the people whose place it was before we got here. Also on the call with me is my colleague Jess Beagley. I'm not sure Jess is going to be able to stay the whole time, but maybe Jess give a wave because I do mention you a few times because Jess has been leading our policy work. With that, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, and I'm going to jump into the presentation. Jess or someone just want to quickly unmute to let me know if you can see the full screen. Okay, great. We're going to do a couple of these sessions. So either we'll share the recording from today's meeting or from another meeting. And in the slide deck that I'm sharing, any links that I'm talking about or resource pages are going to be in the notes section of the slide deck. I want to start by noting that even though we're talking a lot about COP today, COP is not the only or even necessarily the best place to make action to protect health from climate change. Those actions, I know many of you are taking them in your own work, and they're happening throughout the year. And part of the reason I think that framing is important is because as we come into this work, that's just a quick summary of the agenda. As we come into this work, there's some things that I think it's important to be mindful of that apply always to the climate and health space. The first one is we're grateful you're here because health actors need to be collaborating for a climate safe future. And so bringing health to the table at COP and at other international meetings is really important. There's a cluster of key high level actions that we can all be working towards that will make a marked difference in protecting health from climate change. I'm going to run through them pretty quickly. And the reason I'm setting this frame is because, again, I think it's really important to see COP within the broader goal that we're trying to achieve. So top of the list is we need to phase out fossil fuels to protect health. We know that air pollution causes everything from asthma to chronic illness and cancer, and that fossil fuels are a primary driver of the warming that is harming our health and our planet's health. So a major thing that we can do to protect health is phasing out fossil fuels, and that's not the last time you're going to hear me say that. Within that, we need to transition our health systems so that they're low emission, they're not adding to the problem, but that they're ready to respond in the face of a climate disaster like flooding in Malawi. We need to rebuild the cities that we live in so that they're better prepared to protect people in moments of extreme heat, but also so that they're more walkable and that they allow or rollable and that they allow active transport, and they're well connected to other communities with electrified rapid transportation. So the places we're living actually contribute to our health and to the safety of our future. We're going to need to be thinking about how we expand access to clean water and healthy food, particularly as the context for agriculture changes. And again, one of the reasons it's really important to be having this conversation is climate change is going to threaten all of the gains we've made in health across the board, and investing in action now can save lives and money in the future. And finally, we're not the first people in this space. Health actors can really learn a lot from people who've been here for a long time. So I hope that if you are coming to COP or if you're new to the climate space, you're able to find other groups who are hosting orientations and meetings like this one to kind of get a sense of what other people who've been in the climate space other than us are saying. So I'm actually going to start with that broad context. Now we're going to head into our focus on COP. And we're going to go way back to the beginning when in 1994, when the UN came together to put forward the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The acronym is the UNFCCC. And it came into force in 1994. And it was remarkable for its time because The convention acknowledged that human emitted rising greenhouse gas concentrations were going to interfere with the climate unless we took dramatic action, and laid out a plan to address it. Within that, the convention also sets this goal that we will act to protect a safe and healthy future. That convention put the onus on wealthy polluting nations who had been polluting for longer and making money from it, and who therefore were better resource equipped to deal with the consequences of climate change, and also directed funds to those places most impacted. It set up a system to keep tabs on what's been done, and kicked off this formal consideration of how were we going to adapt to climate change. So even in 1994, we knew that there wasn't going to be enough that we could do to stop all of the climate impacts. And this convention said, okay, how will we get ready for the changes that are coming? And also while we continue to try to keep warming to the minimum extent. A page that outlines the convention is again in the bottom of this slide. And I think it's worth looking at to get a sense of how long this conversation has been ongoing. So that convention also put into place this practice of meeting every year, twice. There's a big set of meetings in June, where that's much more the negotiators who are getting together to sort of plan with each other what's going to happen for the rest of the year. And then there's the conference that we're going to spend most of our time talking about, which is the Conference of the Parties, the COP. One of the probably the biggest COP that you might have heard of before was the COP that gave us the Paris Agreement. And I think it's worth just taking 2 minutes to hear from somebody else. I'm just going to make sure I am screen sharing with sound.
What is the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This requires economic and social transformation to face the climate challenges now and moving into the future based on the best available science. The Paris Agreement works on a 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action. By 2020, countries communicate their plans known as nationally determined contributions. Countries communicate actions they will take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Countries also communicate actions they will take to build resilience to adapt to the impacts of rising temperatures. This may include information on adaptation and finance flows. The Paris Agreement also provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. Starting in 2024, countries report transparently on actions taken. Collective progress under the Paris Agreement will be assessed through a global stocktake. This will lead to recommendations for countries to set more ambitious plans in the next round.
So, notable things that were in the Paris Agreement. Just going to get my screen up one more time. So, it's legally binding. It set this 1.5 mitigation goal. So that this agreement from all of the countries in the world that they were going to do whatever they could to keep their emissions, to reduce their emissions, to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We didn't set up an equivalent goal on the adaptation front. Partially, it's a little bit more challenging because where you can take sort of an average of temperatures internationally, it's tricky. Adaptation is often much more localized. So it's trickier to find a global statement that can apply everywhere on what good adaptation looks like. The Paris Agreement also created the Green Climate Fund, which is how the funds that are being brought in from those wealthier polluting nations to support countries that are going to see a lot of warming, that money is coming into something called the Green Climate Fund, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And it also initiated the Paris Agreement initiated the first 5 years of nationally determined contribution. I am going to take a moment to jump into a little bit more about what nationally determined contributions are. But before I do that, I just want to highlight that while the negotiations that happen at COP are happening at a national level between countries, civil society is super important. Any gain that has been made to protect our future and protect health within the COP negotiating rooms has been hard won by activism by civil society. And the photos on the screen, yes, are of marches, but that's partially because like hundreds of meetings with decision makers do not make good photos. So just wanting to flag that there is this long history. So we had people for years calling for wealthy countries to pay for damages that were happening in other parts of the world. And that brought us things like the polluter principle that is a core tenet of the Green Climate Fund. There's been huge activism by Indigenous people, and that has over time led to the establishment of what's called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, which is a way for Indigenous people from around the world to weigh in on what they're seeing happening in their traditional territories, what they see that could be done to protect the future. And that's like a formally established process that happens at COP. And then finally, there was huge activism last year with a focus on trying to push for a loss and damage facility. So already we've talked about the 1.5 degree goal and adaptation, but this other piece of I'm going to ask folks to mute if you can. This other piece of sort of funding that people have been pushing for a long time is to address loss and damage. So adaptation is how we get ready for a climate change future, but how do we pay for impacts that are already happening? Are there funds available to Pakistan when there's massive flooding, for example? And so Global South countries had been asking for another set of money to be set up to be to be accessed when disasters happen. And after huge activism by civil society, a process to get a loss and damage facility was initiated last year at the COP in Sharm el Sheikh. So just wanting to really highlight that Health Civil Society is joining a years-long active and powerful movement for a safe and healthy future that brings together literal thousands of people from across sectors and groups. And so we're in really good and powerful company. Before I jump into saying things about NDCs, I'm just going to check in the chat whether anybody's got questions. Okay, so I'm going to press on with the nationally determined contributions. So nationally determined contributions are frequently just called NDCs. They are the commitment that plan that every country makes to respond to the climate crisis. So they include all of the mitigation activities, everything that countries are planning to do to reduce their emissions, as well as some of them include adaptation plans. And they're sort of like everybody submits this plan, and then a bunch of people do a bunch of math based on the plan, and then we get a sense of how close are we going to be to keeping to that 1.5 degree target. The last NDCs were submitted in 2020, and they are insufficient to reach 1.5, but they're renewed every 5 years, and the next deadline is 2025. Some NDCs do actually include health directly, but the inclusion of health is not necessarily enough to protect health. So we're going to give you an example very quickly, not to pick on Argentina. It's just a nice example of balancing these two realities. So Argentina actually scores pretty high on including health. They recognize the health impacts of climate change in their NDC, including heat waves and cold waves. They talk about dedicated health and climate plan. And Argentina was the first country to include healthcare sector mitigation measures in NDC. However, that's where you're getting some of the numbers on the scoring on the left-hand side. But at the same time, Argentina's targets for reducing our emissions for mitigation have us set up for 4 degrees of warming. And 4 degrees of warming is not compatible with a healthy future. So there's, again, just reiterating that just because people are talking about health doesn't mean that we're protecting the health of the future. And then, not to pick on Argentina, this dynamic is true of many countries, and some countries don't mention health at all, and also are not doing enough to reduce their emissions. So just something to be thoughtful of as we get into a COP where I think people are going to be talking a lot more about health than they ever have before. The other reason to talk about nationally determined contributions is they're a really important way to carry home the conversation that comes out of COP. So there's opportunities to carry forward the work of pushing for bold climate action that starts at COP into this NDC drafting process. There's also the national adaptation plans. Not all countries have them, but they're a means of identifying medium and long-term adaptation needs. And again, in the slides, there's a link to some example HNAPs, health national adaptation plans from Bangladesh, Nepal, and Thailand. And though all parties have to submit NDCs because that's what they're committing to do, not everybody has to submit NAPs. So a final thought on that, we took this detour because I think it's a document that gets talked about. People talk about NDCs all the time, and I wanted you to know what they were. And then we'll jump into COP. So final thoughts on this is the next set of NDCs is due in 2 years. So people are going to be starting to write those now. And one of our an incredible health advocate from Malawi, Hendricks Mogdi, is an environmental health minister with the Ministry of Health there. And he really encourages health participation in the drafting and creation of NDCs, partially because it gives you an opportunity to build relationships with other sectors. So the energy and transportation sectors, and integrates health in people's thinking from the beginning. And if you do manage to push your health ministry to get involved in drafting the next NDC, it's really important to be, again, remembering that health is about so much more than health systems. So if, as countries get ready to draft their 2025 NDC, not only are they thinking about funding to help their health system adapt, part of the question is, are we building those cities and transportations systems that support health and support equity? Are the food systems protecting health and healthy communities? And of course, are our plans ambitious enough to keep with the Paris Agreement warming targets? So now we're getting into the COP section. So again, COP is the conference of the parties. Parties in this context is nations and territories that sign that framework convention. So the rest of us are not quite a sideshow at the COP, but because, as we said, civil society is really important in making sure bold climate action is taken. But a big part of what's happening is that meeting of national negotiating teams. Okay, so jumping into this, you arrive at COP. This is actually a map of the planned COP venue in Dubai this year. And at every COP, there's a blue zone and a green zone. The blue zone is where the negotiations happen. You have to have accreditation or a pass to get in. I think most organizations who were getting passes should have them by now, but not everybody in the organization, I think, knows whether they themselves are going to be able to access a pass. That's where all the sort of official side events happen. The WHO pavilion is within the blue zone, as well as the other national party pavilions. So often that's where most of what's happening at COP happens, is in the blue zone that you need accreditation to get into, and often there's a fair amount of security to get into the building. The green zone is open to the public. Often passes are available daily. They're meant to be something that everybody in the city can come to. A huge benefit this year is that the green zone is attached. It's like at the same site as the Blue Zone. In Glasgow, for example, you had to like walk over a river to get there, so it was very hard to go. And we've heard that this year's Green Zone is going to have a lot of programming and possibly even some restaurants. So I think it's possible people will be spending more time in the Green Zone at this COP than they have in past COPs. The whole COP venue, I think, is meant to be accessible by it's called Expo City. It's meant to be accessible by the city's public transit. So if you are you'll likely be staying at a hotel somewhere within Dubai, and hopefully it'll be quite easy to get yourself to a transit line and then to get to Expo City. But for more logistical details like that, we do actually have a whole call focused on getting to COP and what kinds of chargers you need to bring, what are the maps, what are the transit stops you need to know. And that'll happen the week of November 20th. So once you're in the Blue Zone or once you're in Dubai, what's happening in a COP? There's sort of, you can put what happens into four big buckets. The negotiations, deciding what is everybody committing to this year, big program announcements, events, and press and communications. I've just seen a note about requirements for accreditation with my appreciations for everyone's patience as I kind of toggle between these two. Rob, I think, largely answered it, but to get accreditation, your organization has to submit a year in advance to be an accredited organization. And once you as your organization have been accredited, then you apply to get a number of badges. And then the badges can be assigned within your team. There are some countries, like national governments who are going to be negotiators, I think have an unlimited number of badges. So occasionally in the past, we have had health colleagues who have good relationships with government get government party overflow badges. And sometimes universities have a small set of badges, like maybe 5 across the university. But the thing I've heard about university badges is that for a while people didn't know that those existed, and so some of them went unused. So if you are associated with a university, I think it's valuable to check whether you get COP badges. I'm not sure how you do that, but that's one track that I know people have used in the past. Okay, so negotiations are really the main event of COP. That's what this whole thing is for. And countries come with negotiating teams of various sizes. So a wealthy country with a lot of resources is likely to bring a pretty big negotiating team so that they can have people sitting in on all different types of negotiations. But countries that like lower income countries are often less likely to have the capacity to do that and might be able to send only 1 or 2 people to a COP. So to balance that off, you have people working in negotiating blocks. So a big one is G77 plus China. And often what they'll do is, or for example, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, and I know AOSIS does this. They often are only able to bring 1 or 2 people, but as you can imagine, they're already being impacted by sea level rise and really want to have ears in the negotiating rooms. So that group of small island states decides who from each country is going to be in each of the negotiations so that between them they can get full coverage. There's an African group, a European group, and often when you get a big meeting, these groups, these negotiating blocks will make statements as a group, or will negotiate as a group. So G77 plus China pushed really, really hard for that loss and damage finance facility. And lots of the pre-work to get positions in the negotiating rooms happens way before anybody even arrives at COP. So some of it will have happened at that meeting in June and in Bonn in Germany, and some of it is still happening. And the negotiations are pretty intense. Often by the end of the week, people have been both picking at what language should be in there, but people are also fighting for the safety and security of their countries. So this is a tweet from a negotiator last year, just highlighting how challenging it can be for negotiators in the course of the week, where you're just spending extremely long hours, sometimes till 2 and 3 in the morning, trying to get to a collective decision about what will happen each year. Jess, feel free to jump in at any point you want to add anything.
Thanks, Jen. Nothing so far.
Okay. So within the negotiations, there's a lot of tracks where the conversations are happening. These are 6 of the big ones. So mitigation, how are we going to keep warming to a minimum? Adaptation, how will we prepare for the warming that's already going to happen because we haven't cut emissions? Loss and damage, how will we fund the response to the impacts that we have been unable or unwilling to prevent via mitigation and adaptation? Lots of people last year were saying, well, the thing about a loss and damage fund is it's so much better to invest in mitigation or to invest in adaptation. Like your money just goes so much farther. But if we don't do that, you will still have to pay for it, but we'll have to pay for it out of the loss and damage fund. Finance, who is paying how much by when? As you can imagine, that's often very contentious. Agriculture and food security, which is like figuring out how do we feed people on a climate change planet with keeping to the limits of what's available to us on this planet. And the global stocktake, which is figuring out how do we measure the progress we're making on the Paris Agreement. And there's been quite a bit of work in the last year to try to have health be one of those ways that we're measuring. There's also often a cover text, which you may have heard about, that is like the Paris Agreement or the Glasgow Pact. I don't remember what it was called in Sharm el-Sheikh, but it sort of is a summary of everything that was decided. And that usually comes out in the second week. And that's where people do end up doing often a lot of trying to hold on to really core and important pieces of text. But there isn't a cover text every year. All right, Jess.
Thanks, Jen. Rob had put in the chat that it's too bad that health isn't its own track, even though it's covered in multiple other themes and tracks. And I can totally see the argument for having health as its own track, but I think it's really worth being conscious of the fact that if health were its own track, that we wouldn't be able to necessarily use health as an argument for ambitious decision-making on mitigation, which is crucial for health. We wouldn't be able to argue as easily for health to be prominent within adaptation or in loss and damage, or for sensible decisions to be made around financing. I think often we see that when there are tracks that are set up on a particular issue, that it can silo that issue out. And really for us, if health isn't being linked to those really crucial decision-making processes, then there are ways in which that could work against us if we were to give parties a reason to call for that. Anyway, that was a slightly badly formulated reply, but just something that I've gathered from what I've been following recently. Thank you.
I don't think it was badly formulated. So this sort of actually speaks to what Jess was saying. Health can be a really important tool for ambitious climate action, making abstract discussions personal. People can think about what is the actual impact of the conversation we're having or the word we're choosing on my health, on my children's health, on my grandchildren's health. The health community has this role in joining civil society to advocate for really ambitious action with using the health argument. And health has been recognized in various texts. So the right to health is in the Paris Agreement and also in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan that came out last year. So how has the health community engaged at COP? This is a photo from last year in Sharm el-Sheikh. And generally what we do with regard to negotiations, this is a process that Jess leads and that I support as I'm able. We get a group of interested, keen health folks together. Part of that group generally tracks negotiations. So they go into the rooms where negotiations, people pick a track. They're like, I really want to hear about what's going on with adaptation. And Jess will set up a process where you sign up for the track you want to cover. In the time you can, you sit in on the discussions on adaptation and do your best to try to take notes on what's happening and get a sense of what's going on in the room. And that's happening in all of the other tracks that we've got people following. And then during a lunchtime meeting, I shouldn't say lunchtime. Lunchtime was the timing we got last year, but during a daily meeting, people come back and share a quick summary of what they've heard so that everybody in the health community who's tracking negotiations can get a sense of what's happening in all of the across the tracks. And then the other part of the group undertakes party outreach. So using health positions that have been developed by I think it's several hundred people over the summer. There's a group that goes out and tries to meet with each country's government to give them the health recommendations, and having the people who are doing party outreach hear from the negotiator, hear from the people who are tracking negotiations, is really valuable, because it means that the negotiations tracking people can be like, I'm going to reference the country I live in. Canada is seems like they're really blocking X, or Canada seems like they're open to pushing for Y, and the health argument could be really, really valuable here. And then the people who are doing party outreach can go forth and re-meet with some of these negotiators who they are building relationships with. I would say that we have seen really, really slow progress. I think everybody at COP has seen this is the 28th COP. Things do not move fast in this process. So I don't think that, like, we occasionally get pieces of language that get moved ahead, but I actually think, like, whether or not we get health language in the text, health being in the room is really, really important. And that outreach to national governments is a really great way to build relationships with your national government that you can follow up on afterwards. And also in figuring out how to engage in the negotiations, there's also a really important opportunity to listen to other constituencies and what other groups are calling for. So I'm going to jump into the policy positions we've developed this year in a moment, but I'll also note that quite often what happens is health comes in with what we've developed, and then something like loss and damage rises to the surface throughout the negotiations, or a piece of language on fossil fuel phase out that needs to be protected becomes evident that, like, we need everybody's energy on that. So at that point, in addition to whatever the health community was calling for, we try to direct energy from the health community to those things that really need extra pressure. Jess.
All I wanted to add to what Jen said was that this process is relatively new in the way that the health community is engaging in the UNFCCC negotiations at COP26. I think there were 3 people from the health community that sat in on negotiations. At COP27, there were 60 people across the 2 weeks, and we're really hoping for similar this week. But also linking back to the point Rob made on the fact that, health isn't currently featured, even though it's related to these different agenda items. In addition to the engagement that it's possible to do at COP, there's also engagement throughout the year. The UNFCCC has a submissions portal. There are calls for submissions on different agenda items, and the 2 agenda items that we've been engaging with for longest, about a year on the global goal on adaptation and a year and a half on the global stocktake. We've really seen health cut through. Health is now in the rooms on both of those 2 agenda items. And as this community, as we collectively build our capacity and our understanding of what goes on in the negotiations and how to engage in them, I think we can expect that for health across different agenda items as well. So really excited to be having this call, and thanks everyone for your time.
Thanks, Jess. So this year, there has been a long and involved process of bringing together about over 100 health folks who are interested in policy to put forward collaboratively what the health recommendations for COP28 should be. And the sentences here are like the high-level summary of what the health community is going to be calling for at COP. They may look generic, but each of these points has it has several bullet points of specificity beneath them in the main document, and then also 2 pages of a deeper dive of information. So if you were interested in meeting with a party on mitigation, for example, you could get a 2-pager that you could leave with them. specifically about mitigation. So in mitigation, no surprise, we're calling for a full phase out of fossil fuels that's in line with the Paris Agreement targets, and a transition to renewable energy that is fair, fast, full, and funded as a public health imperative. This ongoing idea that polluters have to pay. The historically and presently large and rich polluters need to move soonest and fastest. So Canada's definitely on the hook, along with many other wealthy Western nations. On adaptation, we want adaptation planning and monitoring that centers on health outcomes and well-being. And I think there's some potential that health will, as we said, be part of that global goal that gets established. We're going to be calling for a loss and damage fund that is fit for purpose. Jess, can you say more about what you mean by fit for purpose? Is it possible to do that briefly?
So the ways that money can be dispersed currently are through mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund, which takes an incredibly long time. It can take $1 million just to put together a GCF application. Which, obviously isn't any use for communities that have been impacted that need money right here, right now. Likewise, insurance generally requires money to be put in a pot by the countries that would like to take it out of the pot later. That's also really not suitable. Lots of the countries that are worst impacted by climate change are already in considerable debt. So neither of those two options are really fit for purpose for serving the communities that are going to need access to a loss and damage fund, things that take a really long time, or insurance-based mechanisms. I think they're the two biggest things that spring to mind. In terms of where the loss and damage discussions are up to right now, low and middle income countries obviously want there to be funding and want there to be funding quickly. High income countries are pushing quite strongly for the finance to come from private sources and not from countries. You can see where some of the vested interests are already playing out there.
Thanks, Jess. That's really helpful. What's the negotiating track for this climate action to protect health?
Yeah, that would have been action for climate empowerment. Thanks, Jen.
Action for climate empowerment. And then in these other tracks, rapidly scaled, finance strategically allocated for healthy outcomes. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I should have said this sooner. I think a thing that comes up a lot is the idea that we can fund new technologies like carbon capture and storage. And that will mean that we don't have to cut our emissions. One major risk of that is we're not sure how well it's going to work at scale, but more than that, fossil fuels are harming our health, whether they're causing climate change or not, or many of the health risks associated with fossil fuels come from extracting them and burning them. And that's like the asthma and diabetes and neurological disorders and birth risks and cancer that are associated with burning fossil fuels. And so if we put finance into technologies like carbon capture and storage, we're not getting the maximal health benefits. And similarly, I think there are other ways that we can be thinking about funding projects. And I say we, I mean nationally, globally as a community, thinking about ensuring that our funding is going into projects that are going to protect health and people. Agriculture and food security. Go for it.
As well, Jen. Thank you. In addition to thinking about where health fits in finance, it's really worthwhile being conscious that finance is really the thing that's currently holding up a lot of progress in the negotiations at the moment. So at the sort of halfway to COP meeting that took place in Bonn in June, and also at COP27, there's this really strong push from developed countries to make the financing conversation much broader and not just about what developed countries provide to so-called developing countries, but to take the onus off them and look at other financing streams, again looking at private sector finance. And because of these sorts of tensions, this led to mitigation not even being discussed formally in Bonn. It meant that the agenda for the meeting in Bonn wasn't actually adopted until about day 9 or 10 of a 12-day meeting. And it also meant that the adoption of the agenda back at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh was pushed back. So although that part of the finance discussions isn't directly relevant to health, it's incredibly relevant for climate action and therefore relevant for progress on decisions that are going to affect health from that perspective. So worth having ears open on finance in the lead up to COP and contentious issues around that. Thanks.
Thank you. Again, global, Jess mentioned we've been working to try to have health be a measure in the global stocktake. What's the negotiating track for this climate action to protect health?
Yeah, that would have been action for climate empowerment. Thanks, Shay.
Action for climate empowerment. That's probably the track that I understand the least. Anyway, thanks, Jess. Okay, yes, I am gonna pause for questions because I've got a slide to pause for questions. Oh, such a good question from Caroline. What lessons can we learn and best practices can we pick up from other sectors who've been part of negotiations in the past? I think that I don't have a good answer, but I think that's definitely something that we should be listening for and really thinking about. Thanks for flagging that, Carolyn, because again, there have been people who have been working on this for a long time. I think really, yeah, I don't know, Jess, do you want to speak to that at all?
I absolutely agree with that. We do coordinate with other sectors, movements. So gender, oceans, nature, I think are all things that we've seen coming up the COP agenda. We could definitely talk to them more. Would love to connect with anyone that does have deep contacts in any of those communities that have succeeded in integrating their issue more deeply into the COP process. I think something that really, well, was disappointing in many ways, but encouraging in others, was that, you know, health is a relative newcomer on the scene, but in a technical assessment paper that came out of the first 18 months of this first global stocktake, health wasn't mentioned very much, but it was still mentioned more than a lot of issues that have been quite present in the COP process for a while. So health was mentioned more than gender, was mentioned more than nature, was mentioned more than oceans. Those really aren't things to celebrate. All of those things are vital for health. But I think it does show that some of what we're doing is working and working quite rapidly. So we should definitely continue to talk to those communities because there's definitely a lot more we can learn from them too.
Just to highlight Vijay's, what sorts of questions could we be piggybacking on from ongoing negotiations with the pandemic accord? I don't think that I have an answer to that, but I do think it's important to think about what's going on there because there are so many similarities where the wealthy nations have the resources to respond to a crisis and are unwilling to share those resources or seem to be unwilling to share those resources with countries who have less resources, even though in many instances the countries have less resources because the wealthy countries took them several hundred years ago or continue to take them today. So I think there's lots to be learned. Again, also with the intersection of nature and biodiversity and what that means for pandemics and the ways that nature and biodiversity are being threatened by climate change. So I think carrying through that thread is really interesting, but I don't have an answer of which, but would love to have you bring that expertise at some point. And in terms of how can health people coordinate and organize around COP28, part of it is this policy process that Jess has been running, and we're going to try to do our best to have GCHA tries to do our best to support lots of ways for health folks to be connecting with each other and working on shared advocacy. There's these sort of three more parts of what happens at COP. So the first of those is announcements. COP is definitely a time where you're going to see people making big commitments that make the news. And a big one at COP26 that we wanted to highlight was ATTACH, which was the launch of this Alliance for Action on Climate Change and Health. And it's a group of countries that are committing to transition their health systems to be low emission, but also climate resilient. It's sort of like a collective alliance hosted by the WHO. And I think it has been really something like that, an announcement of something like that ends up being pretty important because it sets in motion a process where people commit to be working together and learning from each other and sharing knowledge. And I think you are likely this year with the COP28 focus on health, I think we're likely to continue hearing a lot about ATTACH, even though it was launched at COP26. The other thing that they're are often like big announcements. There's lots of announcements about collaborations. There's lots of announcements about initiatives that get started. There's also often a lot of funding announcements. Obviously, climate finance doesn't show up with massive piles of money, but and financing announcements and funding announcements are exciting. They're also they can be a little bit fraught because there has been a trend increasingly at COPs for there to be more and more announcements about programs and funds and finances that are outside of the negotiations process. And what that means is like even the sort of limited methods of accountability, limited though they are, that exist in the UN Convention framework, those aren't attached to things that just get announced as side projects. So if you're seeing big like establishments of funds that groups have set up, that is great because it might be bringing new funders to the table, but it also is sort of, as Jess said in that point about finance, if wealthier countries are not wanting to pay for climate impacts over here in the negotiations, and yet they've pushed a bunch of private companies to make a big announcement about a fund over here. This fund that the private companies are funding with some support of countries, again, is not accountable to the COP process. It's not responsible. It doesn't have to follow this sort of like equity polluter pays principle. And so it's a little bit, the sort of escalation of announcements at COP is a thing that I have heard people raise their eyebrows at a little bit. We need everybody. We need a lot of funding. But just to flag that again, announcements will happen. Some of them are really important. Some of them we just need to ask questions, like be listening, to ask questions about. The big thing that happens at COP are a ton of events and meetings. So within the COP, there's big high level events. There's official side events that perhaps your organization applied for. I don't think anybody's heard whether they've been approved yet. There are pavilion events. I'm sure many of you applied to host events at the WHO pavilion. And then there are events that happen outside of the COP. So I know that the SDG Goals House sets up at COP. The New York Times has set up what they call the Climate Hub, and they do a bunch of programming outside of the COP. So there's tons of events and tons of meetings. Partially because there's thousands of people with a huge range of experience and expertise who come to COP. So it's a really unique opportunity to connect with a lot of people from across sectors and across jobs, and to carry those relationships that you build home with you to continue organizing and working after the COP. Things to think about as you're going to meetings and events, like it is possible to just go to events for the whole 2 weeks. But I think my concern is that if that's what we're doing, we're missing out on understanding what's going on in the negotiations. I'm not saying you have to be in the negotiations the whole time, but keeping an ear to understand what's going on, I do think is really important. One things that we encourage people to think about are trying to get outside of the health bubble. So if you can, trying to host events in spaces other than the WHO pavilion. I heard yesterday that the Sustainable Development Goals Pavilion is accepting events until the 23rd of October. The really frustrating thing about the pavilion setup is like there's no list of all of the pavilions that will be at COP this year. There's only a list of pavilions that were at COP last year. And so to find out whether your country or an organization you're interested in, like ProVeg, is hosting a pavilion this year, the best thing to do is look at last year's list and then do a browser search for that organization plus the words COP28 pavilion, or your government and the words COP28 pavilion, and to see if you can find it that way. I haven't found a better way to do that. There's a group called the Climate Action Network who've been working and focused on policy at COP for years. And they have local and regional meetings. And they're, I think your organization has to be a member of CAN in order to attend those meetings, but they're a really useful place to learn. CAN does some excellent analysis on what's happening in the negotiations. And so I think if you can find your regional CAN meeting and they will let you in, it's really useful to just go and listen and hear what like people who are just in the climate space are thinking about when they're thinking about when they're at COP. And finally, Milena is so good at this, is talking to people as you meet them. So talking to people when you're all riding public transit together and when you're waiting in line for coffee, is useful because you never know who you might be standing beside. It might be the negotiator of a country that you really want to build a relationship with. The other thing I think is like, it is actually a really important opportunity to meet ministers and sector leaders, and unique to this COP, some health ministers and health ministry staff will be there. So I think it is worth trying to get some meetings if you can with folks who will be there on the ground. There's also finally, COP is a huge generator of press and media, and it's partially because those are 2 weeks where the whole world is thinking about climate change and wants to talk about it and wants to run stories about it. And also there's a press center on site in the Blue Zone, where there are journalists who are not always just waiting around to talk to you, but sometimes they are just there. And so it's a really good opportunity to get media. And I do actually think that's true whether you're at COP in person or whether you're at home and you want to write an op-ed or you want to bring your voice to the health conversation in some way, other than being physically in Dubai. So I just wanted to highlight one more thing about finance. Are there two? Oh yeah, a couple other notes on finance. We know finance falls short. Jess already mentioned that finance is going to be like an area that's really sticky. There's this commitment to double adaptation finance, and there's also been commitments from countries. We heard them at the UN General Assembly that countries are recommitting to pay their fair share to the global or the Green Climate Fund. So that's one mechanism by which things are coming in. But I just wanted to highlight, I think it's important when we're hearing about funding, and Jess flagged some of this as well. These are questions I think to like consider, not to like necessarily put your hand up and ask, but when you are hearing new funding decisions related to climate financing, I think it's important to be asking, is this money new or additional? So like, is Canada committing to donate new money from somewhere to the Green Climate Fund, or are they moving money from other projects, like from their like development work into the climate fund? There's a real call that we can't be, the solution is not to move money out of one bucket that you were already committed to funding on like HIV or something into the climate fund. The ask is to commit new funds. Are there strings attached for countries getting money? Is the funding a loan or a grant? How are people accessing it? And what mechanisms exist to ensure funders deliver? And after the UN General Assembly this year, I think something we're actually going to hear a lot at this COP is the relationship between international debt and historical loans that have put countries in huge amounts of debt that make it challenging for them to respond to the climate crisis, and climate funding. And so that, I think what I was hearing at the UN General Assembly were questions around whether some part of climate funding should be debt relief, and was that a fair thing to do? And I'm definitely not an expert on that, but I just wanted to note that I think we're going to hear a lot about this intersection between debt and climate finance this year. And also, friends of ours did a report that I believe is attached in this slide that just made the point that we can be asking climate funds to consider health in their funding, but we also need to be asking health funders to be cognizant of climate impacts and funding climate projects. So it needs to be a two-way street. Okay, final chapter. So I'm sure that you've heard COP28 is unique for health. And we're going to take a moment to talk about why. So the health community has been active at COPs for quite a long time. This is a brief summary. I mean, I know that I definitely heard a story from a health person who was at COP5. George in the chat has mentioned that he's been engaged since COP1. So there's been a growing group of health people who are interested in following the negotiations and are pushing for health to be a consideration and a driving cause for action at the negotiations. But this year is unique because this is an action from last year where a group of health students and residents planned an action at Sharm el-Sheikh, really amplifying calls from the broader climate movement to keep 1.5 alive, to protect the health of their future patients. So health has been very increasingly active and present, often led by really awesome young people. So this COP is unique because the UAE COP presidency has been a major global health funder for a long time, and really have put a spotlight on the health impacts of climate change and the opportunities to protect health in relation to climate change. The ways that they're offering that spotlight are every year there are sort of thematic days. So there's a gender day and a youth day and a science day and an energy day. And this year, for the first time, we have a health day on December 3rd. And during that health day, not only will there be a huge amount of health-related programming, but there's going to be a health interministerial that is bringing health ministers from countries around the world to COP to prepare a declaration on health and climate change. And I think that this is important, again, because we need health to be in conversation with health ministers, to be in conversation with their colleagues in the energy ministry and the transportation ministry and the environment ministries, so that health is considered and a core part of planning for our climate change future. And so I think it is a very important and unique opportunity to have health ministers coming to COP. And if you have a good relationship with your health minister, you might be able to have a role in helping them get ready to come. And I think we're also going to see some big announcements related to financing for health this year. I think a thing that is concerning is that we know that if we don't have fossil fuel phase out, we can mention health and fund health and have a health day forever, and not addressing fossil fuels will not mean that health is protected. And we saw at COP26, we were on this track to get a piece of health language put into the text, and we were really excited about it. And then Australia decided to champion this health language that we've developed. And again, not to specifically shade Australia, but at COP26, they still had a government that was like quite climate denialist, had been blocking progress in the talks, were very invested in keeping the fossil fuel industry growing and functioning. And to see them be interested in using health language, I think sort of raised the alarm for some of us for the first time that health could be used to health wash governments and countries who weren't actually planning to be very ambitious on fossil fuels, but who could talk a good game about health. And so I think that the more that health gets talked about in COP, it's both great and also concerning if health is going to be used by anybody to look like they're doing something good without the accompanying ambition that would be needed to protect health. And so I think it's there's this double opportunity. And so one of them is working really hard to keep the gains we're getting from a presidency who's interested in talking about health for future COPs. So how do we leverage health ministers being at this meeting for the first time? How do we leverage a day where other groups across the climate spectrum are talking about health to sort of cement those as achievements for the future? And at the same time, how do we hold the line to protect climate ambition when we're talking about health? So making sure that we're not getting a version of health that is only talking about adaptation, that is only talking about loss and damage funding, that is only talking about big funding, but is also talking about countries taking enough action to keep global warming to the 1.5 degree target, because we can't adapt. We definitely can't adapt to a 4-degree increase. We're struggling to adapt to a 1.2 degree increase. Many parts of the country I live in were on fire this summer. That's not the only place that's happening. Climate impacts are here around the world. So as we're talking about health, we really need to do all that we can to make sure health is bringing its strength and power to push both on adaptation, which so many countries need funding and support for so that they're ready to respond to this climate change future, but also that we're really actively supporting and calling for the mitigation we need to have a safe and healthy future. So how are we best engaging? The Health Day and Health Focus of COP obviously bring new opportunities. Health ministers are attending for the first time. And I think we can really leverage that. There's also this sort of like, should you be inside or should you be outside? If you can get accreditation, I think it's useful to have lots of health folks inside so we can follow negotiations and meet with negotiators and meet with the health ministers inside, but it's also not feasible or wise for everybody to go to Dubai. It's going to be expensive, and there's expensive and tricky to get to. And it is, flying is obviously a major contributor to fossil fuel emissions. And I think we all acknowledge this sort of challenge and of that, and there's tons of really important work to be done at home, mobilizing in your own community. And I think that there's some work underway to try to brainstorm ways that we might be able to have satellite that health groups could be having satellite events on Health Day. And as I've just said, the health community has this role to play in ensuring climate action protects and promotes health. And I think that's something we're already doing that we can continue doing loudly for the next couple of months. And circling back to those priority actions, I think, again, COP provides us with an opportunity to make progress on all of these things. And you don't have to personally be responsible for pushing forward each thing. We need people who are working on food. We need people thinking about water. We need people thinking and talking about disaster response. So part of getting involved in the COP process is figuring out what is the way that you best fit in this broad conversation. I think a common saying in the climate movement is, to change everything, we need everyone. And so if you show up and you're really keen to follow the loss and damage negotiations track, fantastic. If you're really keen to spend your time going to a bunch of different pavilions to make connections with people across sectors, also fantastic. If you need to stay where you're based, but you have the time to send some tweets or write an op-ed or bring the health focus to the climate conversation to your home community, I also think that's so powerful, because so many of the decisions that impact our ability to respond to climate change happen in local communities. They happen provincially or at the state level. They happen municipally. And so we can push across the board. This final slide of like upcoming things from us, from GCHA. There are no more orientation sessions unless we get a bunch of emails from folks who'd really like to have them, but we are going to post a video. Jess should have the policy recommendations available for sign-on potentially next week. And then in sort of middle of November, she's going to host a series of deep dive conversations where, if you really want to hear about mitigation, we're going to have a 45-minute session where you can hear from a climate person who always thinks about mitigation, from Jess on what the health policy positions are, and then time for questions. And we're going to do that for all of the tracks that have a position. So I believe that there will be 12 deep dive sessions. You don't have to come to all of them. A question we got yesterday was like, should health actors, basically like, should we just all think about adaptation, or should we be looking broader? Definitely people should be looking broader and following other tracks, but I wouldn't recommend following 3 tracks. I think it makes sense to pick a track or maybe 2 and really pay attention to those ones and try to understand what's going on in those ones, because there's just too much going on to try to be in 3 or 4 tracks. So same with the deep dives. Don't come to all 12. Pick the 2 or 3 tracks you're most interested in and maybe come to the deep dive on that. But information about how to come to those will be shared via email. Again, to do with this sort of like really wanting to make sure that the conversation about fossil fuel phase out is alive coming into COP. Health leaders are planning to release a letter in early November, really just pushing for ambitious fossil fuel phase out, and that just energy transition that is fair, funded, and forever. We're planning to have an activities roundup where every organization gets one slide to share what they're doing at COP on November 9th. And then there's that final logistics session the week of November 20th. And finally, GCHA for last year was really fortunate to co-host a networking reception for health folks with the Climate and Health Foundation and a few other partners. And this work is challenging. It's easier and more effective when we do it together. And so the reception is a really great opportunity to connect with people in person. Yeah, from noting from Paige, the Climate and Health Conference is not happening this year. We found after COP26 in Glasgow, coordinating a conference outside of COP, while there was also the health pavilion, was in some ways a duplication and also just was quite challenging. So since the WHO has had a pavilion, we're not doing the conference anymore. We're offering a reception instead, which is not the same level of programming, but is still an opportunity to connect with people. Yeah, good question, Albert. So this comes up a lot. What happens to developing countries that rely on fossil fuels for either for their economy or heating or powering their homes and their lives? I think that part of the reason that there's this huge push for wealthy polluting nations to pay up is the understanding that those countries like Canada made a bunch of money from using fossil fuels. I think, though, the cost is that also in Canada, communities that were close to fossil fuel extraction sites, largely Indigenous communities, have had really negative impacts for their health, like unusual levels of cancer, risk of spills, and many of the impacts of being near fossil fuels are slow diseases. So a family might not know that exposure to an oil extraction site near their home is bad for their health, and their child has cancer several years in. And I don't say that to be fear-mongery. Like I just recently know several stories of young people who living near fossil fuel sites who developed cancer. So I think that the risk is like wealthy countries with the resources to build new technology and to have healthier populations, and who are noticing that fossil fuel driven cars, for example, are being linked to things like diabetes. Wealthy countries are saying we need to get away from fossil fuels. And there's a risk that those cars that people have been driving that are polluting the air in wealthier parts of the world are going to be brought to places in Africa, places that are other parts of the world that are lower income economies due to global resource extraction. And so then those populations get exposed to these cars that people in Europe have decided they don't want to breathe the air from anymore. We saw that with tobacco. We saw that when wealthy countries started to ban tobacco to protect health, the tobacco industry went after the places that had less regulation to protect health. And I think the call for a just transition, I see your point, Albert, is that like not only should wealthy nations be providing funds to lower income economies, they should be providing technologies. They should be sharing whatever technology is developed so that the transition is equitable, and that countries who are either reliant on fossil fuels or who are now being sold cheaper technologies that are burning fossil fuels are getting actually the best and newest technology that doesn't put their population's health at risk. Because I think that is the responsibility of wealthy nations, is to ensure that like everybody in the world should have the best technology that's available, because we are all trying to respond to the climate crisis together, and leaving people to use polluting energy is just like it's not fair. So that's where when you hear calls for a just transition, part of the just transition, I think, nationally is often about like, how do we support workers who are working in fossil fuels or working in fossil fuel intensive jobs to continue to have jobs in a green economy. But globally, the call for a just transition often has to do with this technology transfer and making sure that everybody has the opportunity to get non-polluting technologies.
I had a question about
yeah.
the session on the 20th of November that you're organizing on the logistics, and I wondered, how will you send the invitation to the same group of people?
Yeah, we'll send it around to everybody who registered for this session. I think that initially I had scheduled that session I'm not based in the States, so I scheduled it on American Thanksgiving and got feedback from some of our American colleagues that we needed to change the day. So I will send an updated invitation with the more accurate date to everybody who registered for this.